Join us on the program right now, though. Very pleased to have with us from the Center for Individual Freedom, Mr. Troy Senik. And Troy, thank you so much for coming on the program tonight.
Good, Cam. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Look, we love talking to your colleague Tim Lee with the Liberty Update every week, and it's a real pleasure to have you on the program. Saw your piece at cfif.org, The Troubled Mind of Eric Holder. And now, what exactly are you delving into here with your column, Troy?
Well, the idea, the reason that it's called The Troubled Mind is the sort of broad thesis that I'm presenting with the piece is the idea that there's a consistent pattern with Attorney General Holder of seeing every sort of policy disagreement as something that's motivated by bad faith on the other side, and especially when it comes to race. And you see that particularly playing out this week, the reason that I wrote the piece, with the Justice Department's decision to prevent Texas from implementing their new voter ID rules, which, of course, the Justice Department has authority to do under the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And they did it to South Carolina as well in December, and the operating rationale for it is that it has a disproportionate impact on poor minority voters, which overlooks some pretty basic responses that these states have built in, including the fact that these forms of identification that are required are offered to voters absolutely free. So it gets pretty hard to make the argument that it's a pecuniary issue.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is, so the Obama administration has gone after similar laws, and they've been smacked down by the Supreme Court pretty hard, haven't they?
Well, the Supreme Court has shown a resistance to this. These cases with Texas and South Carolina are both in the federal courts right now. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of confusion about this because in 2008, the Supreme Court heard a voter ID case out of Indiana. And in fact, Justice Stevens, nobody's idea of a hardcore conservative, wrote the opinion for the majority and found it to be perfectly reasonable that a state would put these kinds of requirements on voting. But there are some different issues involved with these states that are covered under the Civil Rights Act. Because Indiana was not one of those states, it's not clear whether that opinion would hold for these states that do fall under the Civil Rights Act.
Okay. Now, as you point out, this is a part of a pattern from this administration, this sort of, arrogance and this hubris and this idea that any sort of criticism or complaint must be politically motivated. Another area where we've seen this, frankly, is with Operation Fast and Furious, where the Attorney General has complained when he's been testifying before Congress about the political nature. He's in essence called this a partisan witch hunt. He's complained about the partisan politics, and he has even complained that he's not getting the credit that he deserves as Attorney General,
right.
When he's been called on the carpet to try to explain Fast and Furious.
Yeah, and there's a deep irony to all of this, of course, which is that it completely undermines the case that President Obama was making as a candidate in 2008, which was a case for a sort of elevated politics where you argued things on the merits, but you didn't get into impugning other people's motives. And there's actually a tie-in between Fast and Furious and the racial aspect of this with Holder, because it was, of course, Fast and Furious that he was alluding to back in December in the New York Times piece, where he complained that the attacks on him were a way to get at the president. And he said explicitly that at least part of that was because of the fact that they were both African American. That's a big assertion to make if you don't have anybody explicitly making that case on the other side. And obviously it's a dodge for dealing with the issue on the merits.
Well, yeah, it certainly seems so. One of the interesting things that you point out, you say when grilled on Capitol Hill about the Justice Department's failure to follow through on the case involving J. Christian Adams about the political hiring within the Department of Justice and the new Black Panther case in Philadelphia. Holder snapped, you write, when Republican Congressman John Culberson of Texas quoted Democratic activist Bartle Bull, who witnessed the event, as saying, quote, "It was the most blatant form of voter discrimination I've encountered in my life." The Attorney General's response was, quote, "Think about that. When you compare what people endured in the South in the 60s to try to get the right to vote for African Americans, and to compare what people were subjected to there to what happened in Philadelphia, which was inappropriate, certainly that, to describe it in those terms, I think does a great disservice to people who put their lives on the line, who risked all for my people." We've heard, again, something very similar, where, again, with Fast and Furious, where Eric Holder will say, yeah, look, I mean, clearly this was a tragedy, but and he will immediately try to minimize the fallout and the damage done by Operation Fast and Furious.
Right. One of the recent hearings, there was some prolonged parsing going on from Attorney General Holder when he was being grilled on this by members of the House about whether or not he had actively been lying or just being evasive. And the room actually broke out in laughter as he was saying this, because everybody realized that this was shades of Bill Clinton, and it depends on what your definition of is. And he just sailed on very pleasantly, pretending that it didn't happen. And the specific instance that I cited in the piece that you referenced about the Black Panthers case, I just found it to be again a complete dodge, because if you hide behind the experience of blacks in the 60s, obviously it's pretty difficult for people to criticize you because there's such a moral loftiness about that. But if you dissect his answer, there are all these sort of pathologies in it. I mean, there's the racial tribalism of that phrase, "my people." You can almost miss as the aside the fact that he takes this incident with the Black Panthers, which would have caused a huge hue and cry, rightly so in the media, if it had been, members of the Ku Klux Klan doing the same thing, standing in front of a polling place, holding a billy club, and he just says, well, it's inappropriate, certainly. And so you've got this, disgusting event, and he's talking about it as if it's a breach of etiquette. And so he has this wonderful sort of rhetorical tendency to be able to try to minimize these things and just move on as quickly as possible.
Do you see? I saw. I think it was Jim Curry, who is I think is with the National Association of Chiefs of Police, said earlier today on his Facebook page that if Holder or Napolitano became a political liability between now and Election Day, that Obama would jettison them. Do you see that, Troy? Because I got to tell you, I mean, it certainly seems like Eric Holder is as entrenched in Washington, D.C. as any political figure I can remember in recent history.
Oh, I completely agree, Cam. And the reason I agree is I think the predicate of that sentence is wrong. If he becomes a liability, it's hard to imagine how he could be a bigger liability than he is now. I mean, if Fast and Furious wasn't enough to do it, that's got to tell you that there's something beyond just base politics going into that. There's a calculation that he's probably somebody with whom the president is ideologically sympathetic. If he's made it this far, if he's weathered this many storms, I think it would take a controversy of really monumental scale and scope to dislodge him. I think it's very unlikely.
I would agree with you. Again, at least going willingly from the Obama administration. Now, you do have a Congress pursuing contempt charges against the Attorney General for failing to turn over documents in Fast and Furious, and it certainly looks like the scope of that case is going to be expanding as well. So I guess we'll see. But, I mean, the good thing, I guess, Troy, is that this is not something that the Attorney General has been hiding behind closed doors. The video is out there for people to watch and see for themselves the attitude and the arrogance and the hubris that the Attorney General has displayed when faced with honest questions about DOJ policies.
Right. And there's been a long tradition of it. I mean, it'd be one thing if you could say there's an isolated incident where he maybe spoke out of turn, maybe hadn't gathered his thoughts. But you see, for instance, on these racial issues that keep coming up, it's not just the incidents with the Black Panthers. It's not just what he said to the New York Times. This started, remember, 3 or 4 weeks into his tenure when he gave this speech where he called the nation a nation of cowards, where race was concerned. And there are policy implications to this, too. I think people tend to forget this. Both cases are about a year old now. But remember that Holder's Justice Department, they sued the New York City Fire Department to try to get them to hire more minorities, did the same thing with the police department in Dayton, Ohio. In both of those cases, the reason those departments were making good faith efforts, the reason it hadn't worked was because the candidates that they were considering couldn't pass the tests. And the Justice Department actually wanted an F to count as a passing grade for the police department in Dayton, Ohio, in order to meet these quotas. Even the president of the local NAACP objected to that move. So it's rhetoric, certainly, but it's even beyond rhetoric. There are definitely policy implications for this where the Holder Justice Department is concerned.
Absolutely. Hey, listen, Troy, thank you so much for coming on the program, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Cam. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Troy Senig with the Center for Individual Freedom.